And the other thing I think that's positive is we didn't talk to, and I'm sure it's the case for some folks. We didn't talk to anyone that was like, "Well, I'm just going to pack up and move." Everyone was trying to figure out, how do I put the pieces back together and continue my life here in Western North Carolina? How can we do that and make our community better and become more resilient uh, if and when we've got to get another storm like this?
Talking about Hurricane Helene, the storm that made headlines for its rapid intensification in the Gulf of Mexico. And really, the big shocker for a lot of people was the catastrophic flooding hundreds of miles inland to places as far as, say, Asheville, North Carolina.
That's exactly the kind of surprise we honestly probably should stop being surprised by. Climate change is supercharging storms with warmer oceans and a thirstier atmosphere. That basically is now allowing hurricanes to rewrite the rules about where and how they can cause impacts and devastation.
This is Curiously Climate, a Climate Central podcast where we transform complex climate science into something that's more personal.
And today we're talking with a meteorologist who covered Helene. He saw it coming and has been covering the recovery over the years since the storm changed the fabric of life in Appalachia.
Yeah, I think we knew days and days ahead of the storm that it was not going to be good for North Carolina. And then as the storm approached, when it strengthened quickly over the Gulf, and we saw what model output was spitting out for the amount of rain that would fall over Western North Carolina, we knew that was going to be really bad. And then things got even more serious even before the storm made landfall in Florida.
That's Spectrum News 1 North Carolina meteorologist Lee Ringer.
We talked about climate change's role in the storm with him, but first, we really wanted to understand what it was like the days leading up to the hurricane, and when he, along with everyone else, realized that this wasn't just, another storm passing through North Carolina.
We had an old frontal boundary and that was pulling up moisture essentially from the storm, and it was raining in Western North Carolina and in our mountains before Helene even hit or made landfall in Florida. And so that was very, very concerning. And I recall the conversations that we were having internally with our station management, our weather team was having with our station management about where to place teams, but also with our news team about covering the storm. And we were talking a lot in those briefings that this was going to be catastrophic for North Carolina and that we should be using those words on air. Our brand at Spectrum News and Weather on the Ones is that we are the calm in the storm. So anytime we have severe weather or tropical system, we really try not to hype the storm, but this is the one that we encouraged using those really strong words. I mean, it's what the National Weather Service eventually was using about the same time that we started using that ahead of the storm, that this was going to be catastrophic. And I remember looking at some of scripts that were being used in our coverage prior to the storm and encouraging our producers to use stronger language, that this was going to be potentially an historic event. I don't know if we could have ever foreseen how bad that it was going to be, but we knew that it was going to cause a lot of problems for us.
I'm thinking back to Hurricane Harvey, and I remember the first day that we saw a 50-inch rainfall total show up on the forecast models, and I was like, that's funny. There's no way that could happen. How do you get 50 inches of rain? But there was a point where the rain amounts being forecast for Helene were just as unfathomable. So, Lee, how do you communicate something that's so hard to wrap your head around?
Yeah, to some extent, when you see an historic event like that in the model data, it's hard to believe. But at the same time, several years before, in 2018, on the eastern side of the state, we had been through Hurricane Florence, and it was the same situation. The model data and the amount of rain, is that really going to happen? And it did, and it was more in some cases. And a week or two prior to Helene, we had another historic rainfall event, just very localized to our southern coast of North Carolina. So the other side of the state, it was an unnamed storm. It was only called a potential tropical cyclone. It never really developed, never got an organized center, but some of our communities along our southern coast, south of Wilmington, had an historic amount of rain that created flooding in communities like Carolina Beach and then Brunswick County, North Carolina, which is near the South Carolina state line. And in that system, I hate to use the word overperform because that's not a good way to accurately describe it, but that system produced a whole lot more rain than modeling had said, and that was a week or two before Helene. So we knew that had happened, and so we were looking at these huge totals in the model data for Western North Carolina from Helene and thinking, will it be even more than that?
Okay, time out. Let's pause here because what Lee is describing, these back to back extreme rainfall events, that is exactly what climate science tells us to expect more of. When we talk about climate change and hurricanes, it's not that climate change creates these storms out of nothing, but it is making them more intense and bringing bigger impacts.
Right. I always like to say a hurricane is gonna hurricane, but the warmer than they should be because of climate change waters that these storms are encountering is what gives them that extra oomph. And thanks to attribution science, we have several ways of understanding the fingerprint that human created heat trapping pollution plays a role here. Think of it as a how much more likely is a temperature or extreme weather event due to humans messing with the climate index?
The World Weather Attribution is a group of scientists who study how climate change influences extreme weather events. Actually, did a rapid analysis on Hurricane Helene, and what they found was, bonkers. First, let's talk rainfall. In both the coastal areas where Helene made landfall and the inland mountain regions where we saw that devastating flooding, our world has warmed by 1.3 degrees Celsius. Now, expects a coastal rainfall like Helene's to happen about once every 7 years, while the inland rainfall is now expected about once every 70 years.
Yeah, so putting the science to work, we know that the rainfall for both regions was made about 10% heavier. But really, when you look at the big compounding impacts here, 2 day rainfall totals were made 40% heavier, and the 3 day rainfall totals that we saw up in Appalachia made 70% heavier. But get this, Tom, if we get to a world that is warmed to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre industrial average, so much warmer than what we're living today, the report shows that the rainfall will be another 15 to 25% more likely to occur.
It's again unfathomable. And the other piece here is the ocean temperatures. Hurricanes are these heat engines. They literally feed off of this warm ocean water. And Climate Central's Climate Shift Index Ocean tracks how climate change is affecting sea surface temperatures day by day across the entire planet. Now, for Helene, warm ocean temperatures the storm developed over were made 200 to 500 times more likely because of human caused climate change.
Okay, so let's noodle on that for a second. 200 to 500 times more likely. Essentially, without climate change, those water temperatures, even in, September as we were coming down from the heat of the summer and hurricane season, would be virtually impossible without the influence of climate change, without the influence of us as humans. But with this heat, rapidly intensifying storms are becoming the norm. Heat boosted sea surface temperatures supercharged Helene, turning it from a natural disaster into an unnatural one.
This is climate change.
So when Lee talked about seeing those unprecedented rainfall forecasts over and over and over again for North Carolina, this isn't necessarily a one-off. It's a new reality that we have to be on the lookout for in a warming world. All right, back to the convo with Lee.
So, Lee, we know that climate change didn't create Helene, but the science shows it supercharged it, intensifying both the coastal winds and all of that mountain rainfall. Now, as a meteorologist who's trusted, super trusted in your community, how do you help viewers connect those dots without completely overwhelming them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it started well before we even knew that there was going to be a Helene at the start of hurricane season. Each year we do a hurricane special to help folks all across North Carolina, where they're folks that watch us at the coast or in the mountains, as we're a statewide network across the state. And so we touched on in that special leading into the 24 season that the water was unusually warm in the Atlantic basin, and that could lead to rapid intensification of storms as they approach any coastline. And we also made the connection that these storms are producing heavier rainfall. So those conversations start at the start of hurricane season. I think when the storm is actually approaching, it's tough to make that connection because I think a lot of our focus is how is this going to impact us right now? How much rain are we going to see? What is the extent of the flooding? And then after we saw so much destruction, it's a really tough decision to, at that point, it's all about safety. I mean, we had folks that were completely cut off, roads from their homes were completely destroyed. Even the city of Asheville didn't have drinking water for over a month. So you're really focused in on telling the stories of the community, telling other parts of the state how Western North Carolina needs help. And then I think the big question, and we talked a lot about this with our news managers and amongst our weather team, is at what point do we start talking about how this may have been influenced by our warming climate? And we did that just a little bit shortly after the storm, but we really did a deeper dive in it on that topic about a month or a little over a month after the storm.
That is such an interesting point and a hard thing to juggle. You maybe can't expect folks to be able to take in and understand attribution science in the moment when they're trying to piece their community back together and don't have basic things like water or electricity or connectivity. But you did some incredible follow-up reporting after the waters receded to make those climate connections. So tell us about that farmer you met who was walking through half a foot of contaminated mud covering their fields.
For that one particular farmer that I talked to that really just farmed a small plot of land that was right along the Swananoa River, one of the rivers that had extensive flooding. And she and her partner farmed that just generally for flowers and some produce for their community members. But she had a lot of concerns, as you said, about what was in that flood water and what it left in that half a foot or whatever it was of mud at the time and soil that was left behind. And we did that story to talk about those concerns, but also to let folks know that there were services for folks that may be concerned about their home garden that maybe have the same situation. And the North Carolina State Extension Service at the time was helping to do some soil sampling. So when the story aired, that short amount of time, there was some positive news in that we followed up on, that at least some of the preliminary soil samples were coming back, that they were not as much of a concern of these toxic chemicals, at least spot checking there. And for that particular farm that we talked about, their soil samples came back okay. They planted again in the spring and summer. I followed along with their Facebook page, and they've planted a lot of flowers, which I think is what they did a lot of before, making bouquets to share with their community. And I think they've had some vegetables that they've grown there as well. So the news is positive for them.
That's great to hear that there's some resilience there. But I'm curious, are businesses and communities, though, recalculating how they build back after these sorts of major events?
It's amazing to see in some communities the recovery that has happened now around a year after the storm, but it's also tough to see those that are still struggling. And there are some businesses that have not come back, and there are some that have come back better. But it's still a long road ahead for some communities in Western North Carolina.
You also went and talked with students at a high school about their climate concerns after Helene. What surprised you the most about those conversations?
Yeah, first of all, I should probably point out the school I talked to was the North Carolina School of Science and Math. And it's a statewide school. They have two campuses. One is located in the Research Triangle in Durham. The school I talked to is one of their newer campuses that's in Morganton, that's in Western North Carolina and closer to the area of the state that was just so heavily impacted by Helene. So these were some of the state's best and brightest. One point, and I guess this really is not terribly surprising when you're talking to students that are going to a school that's really focused on science and math. There was no debate at all about the warming climate impacting Helene. It was very clear. They had no questions that whether that was happening or not. They had a deep interest in understanding how Helene caused so much damage. And this was talking to a earth science class, and their professor or teacher was linking Helene to her lesson for the day when I visited. And it was interesting to note after I talked to some of the students after the class that there were ones that weren't necessarily wanting to pursue a career or research specifically in weather, meteorology, or climate, but they had a lot of questions on how it would impact their field of study. Like there's one student that wanted to become a veterinarian. How is this changing climate impacting animals in the area? But also, I think there was a deep concern of how it was impacting where they want to call home in their future and what can they do in their area of research or just as a citizen of their community to help the area become more resilient, because this is something that we all have to live with, and particularly we'll have to live with in our future as we have more and more of these storms that are producing heavier and heavier rain.
That's fascinating, mainly because so many meteorologists, weather nerds at our core, get into the science because of a big, impactful storm like Helene. So you could say it sounds like Helene might be inspiring a new generation of climate aware professionals.
Yeah, it is part of the silver lining that comes out of these catastrophic events, because it inspires future scientists, whether that's directly related to forecasting or some other aspect of climate. I aged myself for a little bit, but one of the storms that got me really interested in meteorology was Hurricane Hugo, Category 4, that hit my home state at the time of South Carolina back in '89. And anytime we have these storms that have impacts across North Carolina, it's always interesting to talk to students. Sometimes as years after that, I often talk to meteorology students at NC State, and they all have some storm that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years, and that's the reason why they are there studying meteorology.
All right, another time out here, because I think what Lee just said about students and their future is really important. But there's also a crucial message for anyone listening who thinks that they're safe from hurricanes because they just live inland.
Yeah, absolutely. For decades, we've thought of hurricanes as coastal problems. Like on the Weather Channel, you imagine that TV meteorologist at the coast being buffered by winds. Now, you live a few hundred miles from the ocean, you're fine, right? Wrong. Now, Helene showed us that in a warming world, that in our warming world, hurricanes can be devastating far, far from where they make landfall.
Yeah, Tom, what's interesting after this was they came out because everyone living there thought they lived in this so called climate haven. It isn't just about North Carolina or Appalachia region either. We talked supercharging earlier climate changes doing that with the water cycle as well. Makes it greedier. For every 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming, the atmosphere can hold on to 4% more moisture. So, as hurricanes travel inland, this is important because they tend to be carrying more water with them than what they used to a couple decades ago.
Yeah, and when these storms actually are moving inland, and when these storms actually do weaken, as they do so, they're starting from a higher baseline intensity because of those warming and warmer ocean temperatures. So even a quote weakened storm can still mean huge impacts away from the coast.
Yeah, so let's walk away from hurricanes for just a second. And as we saw so many times over this past summer, summer 2025, the terrain matters a lot too. When you dump extreme amounts of rain on mountainous areas like Appalachia, that water has to go somewhere. It funnels into valleys, turns streams into torrents, and creates flash flooding that can happen literally in minutes. And the things that make these areas so idyllic, that have us flocking to live by them, to camp in them, to go take our Instagram pictures in them, a lot of times also comes with this concern.
And if you live in an inland area, the key is not to think, oh, this doesn't apply to me. You really have to start paying attention to the hurricane forecast, even when you're hundreds and hundreds of miles from the coast. Have an emergency plan. Know your flood risk, because as we've seen with Helene, it can happen. Okay, back at it.
Lee, speaking of people who might not think they're at risk, what do you want anyone listening, maybe even hundreds of miles from any coast, to understand about how storms like Helene actually can reach them?
Yeah, it's really tough. And for folks that have lived in an area for a long time, I think it's just our nature to compare it to a storm that we've lived through. And so it hasn't been too long ago that the remnants of a tropical system have caused a lot of destruction in western North Carolina. The remnants of Fred, which came up from the Gulf, caused flooding and landslides on a much, much, much smaller scale than Helene did. It affected a couple of communities. So we tried to use some examples of that and say, this is what happened in a smaller and weaker storm that didn't produce as much rain a few years prior to that, 2021, there's the potential to see this again, but on a much larger scale, where Fred affected one or two towns like that. We could see a very large part, if not all, of Western North Carolina seeing scenes like that. But again, it's really tough because you're trying to communicate what at that point is potentially a historic event, and it's really hard to envision that.
Since Helene, when you issue forecasts or talk with the community, have you noticed people sort of interacting with you differently? More questions, more anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that's noticeable, and not just from Helene, but a lot of the other storms that we've talked about in the last decade or so that have impacted North Carolina, there's a lot of storm anxiety. And when you see any, even just a little bit of the video and photos of the destruction that these storms do, you understand why. But anytime that we've had rain in the forecast in Western North Carolina, I think viewers on that side of the state have asked, is this Helene? And we've seen that. A lot of my forecasting work, and while our network covers the entire state, and I'm seen on occasion in Western North Carolina, a lot of my forecasting work is done in the central and eastern parts of the state. And so we still get questions about that from Hurricane Florence and Matthew for areas that were devastated by river flooding, and homes and lives that were wiped out by that. Anytime we have any tropical system, I still get questions: is this going to be another Matthew? Is this going to be another Florence? And we're going to hear that for years and decades, probably in Western North Carolina. Is this going to be another Helene?
That storm anxiety is so real. So real. Even a routine thunderstorm can trigger that fear in people who've lived through something traumatic. So, Lee, let's end this on an up note and talk about some hope here. You've witnessed this community up close during the recovery. What's something that's restored your faith or given you hope?
I think it's the sense of community, neighbors helping neighbors. Immediately after the storm, it was neighbors leaning on other neighbors just for access to drinking water and food. But even well after the storm, it's neighbors helping their neighbors to recover. And I'm not talking just about Western North Carolina. One of the interesting stories I did in my series was meeting a couple of folks from coastal North Carolina that took their vacation time, that is, to come to Western North Carolina. And it was one of these stories where I was working to find a fifth story in the series, and I talked to my photographer and said, let's just, there was a cleanup going along the French Broad River near the city of Asheville. It's like, let's don't get in the way, but let's just go and talk to folks, and maybe we'll be led to a story. And that's where we met these two friends from coastal North Carolina, and they had family who had lost almost everything in Hurricane Florence. They had been hard hit by storms because they had lived there in coastal North Carolina all their life, and they knew what it was like to be devastated by hurricanes. And they remembered people from Western North Carolina coming to their community and helping them. So they took their vacation time to go to Western North Carolina to help their neighbors on that side of the state. And that's what it takes when we have such a devastating storm. Is it takes the community of the state and surrounding areas to come and help out. And the other thing I think that's positive is we didn't talk to, and I'm sure it's the case for some folks, we didn't talk to anyone that was like, I'm just going to pack up and move. Everyone was trying to figure out, how do I put the pieces back together and continue my life here in Western North Carolina? How can we do that and make our community better and become more resilient if and when we've got to get another storm like this?
Eiley, what's your favorite part about living in North Carolina?
The mountains and the coast. I'm based in Raleigh, which is a great place to live, but those beautiful mountains of Western North Carolina are only a couple or few hours away, and the coast is. We get all 4 seasons of the year, so as a meteorologist, it's interesting to be able to talk about. We don't want anything like Helene to happen, but it's interesting to track the tropical systems. It's interesting to track the storms we get all times of the year, and the very few occasions that we get a little winter weather here. So it's a great place to live as a meteorologist, and it's a great place to live for anyone.
Any final thoughts before we let you out of here?
No, I appreciate you all having me. I think this is an important conversation. We're still at the peak of hurricane season, and we'll hope we don't have any catastrophic storms this year, but they're going to happen again somewhere in the country at some point. So I think it's important that we continue to spread the message of how these storms are changing and what we can do to stay prepared.
Lee Ringer is a meteorologist with Spectrum News 1 North Carolina. Lee, thank you so very much for taking your time and for the incredible work that you've done covering the ongoing stories and making the climate connection for the good folks of North Carolina.
Sir, thank you.
Hurricane Helene showed us that in a warming world, hurricanes don't respect the old boundaries. They can bring devastating impacts hundreds of miles inland to communities that never thought they were at risk.
Yeah, what I like what Lee said about resilience and community. People always ask, what is the thing that they can do specifically about climate change? And it's communication, but also the power of just neighbors helping neighbors. And as we face more climate charged storms, this human connection is at least one of our continued strengths that we have.
For more information about today's episode, including links to the World Weather Attribution Study on Helene and Climate Central's Ocean Climate Shift Index, you can check it out on our website, climatecentral.org.
I'm Shel Winkley.
And I'm Tom DiLiberto. Thanks for being curiously climate with us.